It's October 1929. The sky above the San Joaquin Valley is the color of hammered tin, and a farmer named Earl Hodges is standing in his field at 4 in the morning with a lantern and a shovel. Not planting, not harvesting, digging. He's digging a trench wide enough, deep enough, and long enough to swallow his Fordson Model F whole, all 2,710 pounds of it. His wife stands at the edge of the field wrapped in a coat, watching the road. Nobody talks. The only sound is iron against earth, and in the distant bark of a dog. By sunrise, the tractor is gone. Not stolen, hidden. And Earl Hodges wasn't the only one. Across California's Central Valley, across parts of the Midwest, and deep into the farm counties of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, the same scene played out that autumn. Farmers who had scraped and saved for years to purchase a Fordson, sometimes paying more than $400 for the machine that had replaced their mules, were now burying them in fields, rolling them into creek beds, hiding them in haystacks and barn floors, packing straw around them and praying the men who came at night would find nothing worth taking. Because the men who came at night weren't taking grain. They weren't interested in livestock. They were there for the tractors. This is the story of how organized crime found its way into American agriculture, why the Fordson Model F became the most stolen piece of equipment in rural America during the late 1920s, and on how ordinary farm families fought back in the only way they knew how, by making their most valuable possession disappear. See that subscribe button? It's our exchange, your way of saying, "This reached me." Not about the action size, but its meaning. Hit it if this resonated, drop a like if it moved you, and comment your thoughts on this story. Let's complete this circle together. Now, back to 1929. To understand what happened, you need to understand what the Fordson Model F meant to American agriculture. Henry Ford introduced it in 1917, and it changed everything. Before the Fordson, farming meant horses, mules, oxen, and the kind of exhaustion that shortened lives. The Fordson was compact, it was affordable by the standards of the era, and it worked. The Model F put out around 20 drawbar horsepower, enough to pull a 3-bottom plow through heavy soil. It weighed under 3,000 pounds, which meant it didn't sink into fields the way the giant steam-powered behemoths of the previous generation had. Ford sold over 750,000 of them in the United States alone by the time production wound down in 1928. That production number matters. The Fordson was everywhere, and what's everywhere becomes a commodity. What becomes a commodity becomes a target. By 1928, Prohibition had been running for 8 years, and in the organizations that had built themselves around bootlegging were flush with money, territorial, and always looking for the next operation. The liquor trade had taught organized crime something important. If you control a supply chain, you control the people who depend on it. Booze was one supply chain, but there were others. Agricultural black markets had existed for decades in various forms, but the late 1920s saw something new emerge: organized tractor theft rings operating across state lines. These weren't opportunistic farm thieves loading equipment onto a wagon. These were coordinated operations with drivers, lookouts, transport networks, and buyers, often crooked equipment dealers or parts brokers who could strip a Fordson and sell its components through legitimate-looking channels before law enforcement even knew it was missing. And a Fordson Model F in 1929 was worth roughly $395 new. On the black market, stripped for parts, the magneto, the carburetor, the rear axle assembly, the cast iron engine block, that same tractor could yield 3 to 4 times its retail value. The magneto alone, a scarce component that farmers needed desperately when their machines broke down, could sell for $40 to $60 in an era when farm wages averaged less than $2 a day. Yet the rings operated with a logic that was almost elegant in its brutality. Rural counties had minimal law enforcement. A county sheriff might be responsible for 400 square miles of farmland with 3 deputies. There was no radio dispatch. The telephone networks in agricultural communities were party lines shared by a dozen households. By the time a farmer noticed his Fordson was gone and found a way to report it, the machine could be 50 miles away, already inside a barn, and already being disassembled. New Jersey became an early epicenter. The state's dense agricultural counties, Salem, Cumberland, Gloucester, sat within striking distance of Philadelphia and New York, where the parts networks were already established. Investigators from the New Jersey State Police documented at least 37 tractor thefts in a 6-month window spanning late 1928 into 1929. The number is almost certainly low. Farmers who reported theft risked being targeted again, as some didn't report at all. In California's San Joaquin Valley, the numbers were harder to track, but the pattern was unmistakable. The valley's agricultural economy had boomed through the 1920s, and large farming operations ran fleets of Fordsons. One cooperative near Fresno reported losing 4 tractors in a single month. 4. A local investigator who looked into it quietly was warned off by men he described, in his notes, as associates of the produce brokers. That phrase, associates of the produce brokers, tells you something important. The tractor theft rings weren't entirely separate from the legitimate agricultural supply chain. They were embedded in it. Parts that came off stolen Fordsons moved through real equipment dealers, some of whom may not have asked hard questions, and some of whom absolutely knew the provenance of what they were selling. This was the reality that farmers faced in 1929. They were dealing with an organized, partially institutionalized criminal network, and they had almost no recourse. Filing a report meant waiting. Waiting meant losing your planting window. Losing your planting window in the era before crop insurance meant losing a year's income. For families already stretched thin by the agricultural depression that had been grinding since the early 1920s, note that the Great Depression didn't create hard times for farmers. It just added urban Americans to the misery farmers had already been living. Losing a Fordson wasn't an inconvenience. It was a potential catastrophe. So they adapted, and the adaptations they developed are genuinely remarkable. Bearing was the most dramatic, but it wasn't the most common. Far more prevalent was the practice of disassembly and concealment. Farmers learned to remove key components. The magneto was the favorite, since a Fordson would not run without it, and hide them separately, as some kept the magneto under the floorboards of the farmhouse. Others hid it in the root cellar, wrapped in oilcloth. A tractor without its magneto was just a very heavy piece of iron, useless to a theft ring looking for operational equipment or complete strip-worthy machines. Word spread through farming communities the way all practical knowledge spread. At feed stores, at church, through letters between cousins in different counties. Farmers developed informal watch networks, rotating who would stay up through the night and who would sleep. Dogs were prized for their alarm value. Some farmers ran wire around their tractor sheds connected to bells inside the house. Crude, effective. The underground nature of these defensive measures tells you something about the institutional failure they represented. These farmers couldn't trust the courts to move fast enough. They couldn't trust law enforcement to have the reach. They couldn't trust the equipment dealers, because some of those dealers were part of the problem. So they became their own security force, improvising solutions out of lanterns and shovels, and the stubborn knowledge that what they had buried in that field was the difference between farming and bankruptcy. The machinery theft wave peaked in 1929 and 1930, then began to recede for reasons that had little to do with law enforcement victory. The Great Depression, which hit urban America with force in late October 1929, eventually strangled the black market. When credit dried up and farm incomes collapsed further, even stolen parts became difficult to move. The criminal networks that had diversified from bootlegging into tractor theft found other opportunities and began to migrate toward them. But the legacy of those years stayed embedded in farm culture for a long time. Had the practice of hiding equipment keys, a habit so universal among older farmers that it became almost a joke among their grandchildren, traces directly back to this era. So does the instinct to mark equipment with hidden identifying information, scratched into metal in places only the owner would know to look. Earl Hodges eventually dug his Fordson back up. He used it for another 11 years, retiring it in 1940 when he bought a newer machine. He never talked much about that autumn. The way men of that generation often didn't talk about the things that had frightened them. But his son remembered helping him dig, remembered the weight of the silence, remembered his mother watching the road with the lantern turned low. The Fordson Model F is a museum piece now. You can find them at shows, lovingly restored, painted in that distinctive dark gray green, their fenderless frames and worm gear steering looking primitive beside modern equipment. People walk past them and smile, as some of them don't know they're looking at a machine that was once considered so valuable that men with connections to organized crime would drive through the night to steal it, and farmers would bury it to keep it safe. That's the thing about history. The objects endure. The stories around them fade. And sometimes all it takes to get the story back is to ask why a man was digging a trench in his field at 4 a.m, with his wife watching the road and the lantern turned low. And if this story found something in you, a curiosity, a connection, something you want to carry forward, share it. Comment below with what surprised you most. Every story we tell here lives or dies by the community around it. And you're the reason we keep digging.